The boarding gate buzzed with activity as passengers prepared for their early morning flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles. The hum of voices and the shuffling of feet filled the air, creating a familiar backdrop of travel. The crowd was diverse, each person clutching coffee cups or carry-ons, their faces reflecting a mix of fatigue and focus. Among them, the first-class boarding group stood slightly apart, exuding an air of exclusivity. Neatly dressed and confident, they epitomized a blend of privilege and purpose. Amid this scene, one man stood out, dressed in a tailored navy suit that hugged his frame perfectly. With polished leather shoes gleaming under the terminal's fluorescent lights, he commanded attention without uttering a word. His stride was deliberate, his posture erect, and his leather briefcase swung rhythmically by his side. The man, in his mid-40s, carried an aura of superiority, the kind often cultivated through years of professional success and self-assured dominance. His sharp eyes scanned the gate, betraying thinly veiled disinterest in those around him. He looked like someone who had climbed high on the corporate ladder, accumulating wealth and accolades, confident that he belonged at the top of every room he entered. As the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, the man strolled forward with an almost smug confidence, ensuring his place among the first to board. Settling into his first-class seat, he adjusted his tie, placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment, and pulled out a sleek tablet. With a flick of his fingers, he was immersed in his emails, the very picture of someone who not only succeeded in life, but also reveled in reminding others of it. His focus shifted, however, when he noticed another passenger making his way down the aisle. In stark contrast to the businessman, this older man moved with a quiet modesty that bordered on invisibility. Dressed in a tan jacket, a plaid shirt, and worn loafers, he carried a small bag with no visible sign of wealth or pretension. His weathered face, etched with lines that told stories of a life well lived, radiated a calm and unbothered demeanor. He shuffled to his seat without drawing attention, adjusted his jacket, and gazed out the window, appearing entirely at peace. To most passengers, the older man might have seemed unremarkable, a simple, unassuming traveler. But to the businessman, he was an anomaly. In a space reserved for society's elite, this man's presence felt like an intrusion. The businessman's eyes narrowed, and a subtle smirk played on his lips. Leaning slightly in his seat, he made a comment, just loud enough to be heard. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be." A few passengers glanced up at the remark, some shifting uncomfortably. The older man, however, did not react. His faint smile and steady gaze out the window seemed to suggest a refusal to engage. His silence only fueled the businessman's need to assert dominance, setting the stage for a lesson he could never anticipate. The plane's cabin buzzed softly, with the familiar sounds of passengers settling in the click of seatbelts, the rustle of carry-ons being stowed, and the occasional low murmur of conversation. In the first-class section, the businessman leaned back in his plush seat, scrolling through his tablet. His tailored navy suit and polished leather shoes announced his status to anyone who glanced his way. He exuded confidence, a man who was used to commanding attention, even in spaces filled with others of equal privilege. But as he shifted his gaze, his focus landed on an older man seated a row away. The older man had quietly settled into his seat, with none of the businessman's flair. His tan jacket, plaid shirt, and well-worn loafers gave him an air of simplicity, out of place in the curated exclusivity of first class. The businessman's sharp eyes lingered on him, his lips curling into a smirk. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be," he said, his voice laced with mockery. The comment was just loud enough to be heard by the older man and a few passengers seated nearby. Heads turned slightly, some curious, others subtly uncomfortable. A woman glanced over her shoulder, her expression tightening before she quickly looked away. A young couple exchanged uneasy looks but remained silent. No one intervened. The older man, however, seemed entirely unaffected. He glanced at the businessman briefly, his eyes calm and unbothered. A faint, almost imperceptible smile flickered across his lips before he turned back to the window. The gesture was neither confrontational nor defensive. It was simply neutral, as if the comment didn't warrant a response. The businessman's smirk faltered for a moment, surprised by the lack of reaction. Undeterred, he leaned forward slightly, his tone growing sharper. "What's the occasion?" he asked, feigning interest. Did they hand out charity upgrades today? The plane cruised smoothly at altitude, the hum of the engines creating a steady backdrop for the soft murmur of conversation in the cabin. In first class, the businessman sat with his legs crossed, his polished shoes catching the light. His sharp eyes glanced at the older man seated nearby, still staring out the window, calm and composed. The businessman's earlier comments had gone unanswered, and the lack of reaction gnawed at him. For someone accustomed to commanding attention and evoking responses, the older man's silence was infuriating. He leaned forward again, his voice louder this time, ensuring nearby passengers could hear. "I am curious," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "What brings someone like you to first class? Big lottery win? Or are you here to reminisce about the good old days back when planes still had propellers?" A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort visible. A middle-aged woman sitting a few rows ahead turned slightly, her expression one of disapproval, but she said nothing. A young couple across the aisle whispered to each other, stealing quick glances at the businessman and the older man. Despite the growing tension, no one intervened. The older man remained unmoved. His hands rested lightly in his lap, his demeanor as calm as ever. Slowly, he shifted in his seat, adjusting the cuff of his tan jacket. For a brief moment, he turned his head toward the businessman, their eyes meeting. His steady gaze held no anger, no annoyance, only a quiet confidence that seemed to strip away the power of the businessman's words. Without a single reply, he turned back to the window, as if the exchange wasn't worth his time. The businessman's smirk faltered. He had expected a reaction, a defensive retort, a sign of embarrassment, anything that would confirm his assumed superiority. Instead, the older man's silence felt like a challenge, one that the businessman was increasingly desperate to win. Unwilling to let the moment go, he leaned back in his seat, speaking even louder, his tone now a mix of mockery and frustration. "Not much for conversation, huh? Let me guess you'd rather sit there thinking about the days before Wi-Fi and smartphones, back when everything was better." He chuckled to himself, looking around as if seeking validation from the other passengers. The atmosphere in the cabin grew tense. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the hum of whispered conversations fading as more people tuned into the unfolding scene. A man in a press suit, seated across the aisle, gave an uneasy smile but quickly looked away when the businessman tried to engage him. The flight attendant, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle, hesitated briefly as she caught the exchange, her professional smile strained. Still, the older man gave no response. His refusal to engage was resolute, an unspoken declaration that the businessman's words held no power over him. His calm demeanor was disarming, even unsettling. To those watching, it was clear who held the upper hand in this exchange, and it wasn't the man with the tailored suit and polished shoes. The flight cabin had settled into a steady rhythm. Passengers were immersed in their routines, reading, dozing, or glancing occasionally at the cloud-dappled horizon outside. The businessman, however, remained restless. His earlier attempts to mock the older man had gone unanswered, leaving him simmering with frustration. He shifted in his seat, casting another glance toward the man in the tan jacket, whose calm demeanor seemed to amplify the businessman's unease. The older man remained an enigma, gazing out the window, as if the world beyond the glass was more deserving of his attention than the buzzing presence beside him. His unflappable composure was a quiet rebuttal, one that the businessman couldn't ignore. But before he could muster another pointed comment, the soft sound of the beverage cart approaching drew his attention. The flight attendant, her professional smile unwavering, stopped beside the older man. She leaned slightly toward him, her tone respectful yet warm. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, "would you like coffee or tea?" For a moment, time seemed to pause. The name hung in the air, rippling through the cabin like a silent shockwave. Passengers who had been absorbed in their own worlds suddenly perked up, their heads turning subtly toward the older man. Whispers began to spread, barely audible but unmistakable. "Eastwood. Did she just say Clint Eastwood?" one passenger murmured to another. "It can't be, but it looks like him," someone else replied, craning their neck for a better view. The businessman froze, his confident facade crumbling in an instant. His tablet slipped from his hands onto his lap as the realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director whose name was synonymous with strength, resilience, and wisdom,